I thought it was a root. It was September 12th, 1985. I was out on the north end of the property, the part my grandfather had set aside decades before. Thicker timber, a stretch of old Douglas fir, a slope that never quite understood the sun. I was digging for a new fence post, shovel biting into clay and stone. The ground there is stubborn. You lean on a spade and it gives one grudging inch at a time. I had my boots full of river-smoothed gravel, my knuckles raw from the handle, and I swear to you I expected stubborn roots, maybe a rock the size of a fist. Not what hit my dig bar when the soil suddenly went soft and hollow. There was a shape, dark and heavy, and when I brushed the dirt away, my hand stopped because my mind couldn't finish the job for me. It was a foot, an 18-inch foot. It lay on its side like it had been set down in a hurry. The skin looked almost like worn leather, thick and dark where the soil had stained it. There were islands of coarse hair clumped along the ankle and the top of the foot. 5 toes, 5, and the nails were broad and blunt, not the teardrop claws you'd see on a bear. I ran my hand along the arch and felt something that made my stomach drop. The bones beneath were not the narrow, dainty bones of a deer or the curved pads of a mountain cat. They had the weight and plain geometry of a primate. A human's maybe, only wrong by proportions. I could measure it. I did. Tape across the longest toe to the heel. 18 inches, just like that. 8 inches across the ball. It fit in the hand like a tool made for a different species of hand. I turned it over carefully and felt the unusual density where the ankle had been cut or broken. There was no blood. There was no green rot. The smell was not the smell I know of dead things. It was more like the dry, tight scent of old leather and wood smoke, if a scent can be dry. For a long time I just sat in the dirt and held the measuring tape and looked at the sky through the firs. I had lived on this land my whole life in one way or another. I had buried dogs and chased escaped calves and found the odd thing a man shouldn't have, an old rusted bottle, a bullet, a silver button, but nothing that made a man who'd seen as much as I had stop and feel like a child again. That day I felt small in a way I can't explain except to say something about the world had rearranged itself. I wrapped the foot in a tarp I keep in the truck for hauling the odd load, tied it with baling twine the way my grandfather would, and drove the 2 miles back to the house with the tarp sweating in the cab like a secret. I called my son, David, and told him to stay away from the North Tract. He asked why. I said only, I found something. Then I called Dr. James Whitmore. I knew Whitmore by reputation. He taught biology at the university up by Eugene. Quiet man, flexible mind. He knew bones. He knew field samples.
I didn't know then how much of what I was about to set loose would end up in people's mouths for years to come, or how quickly other hands would come to lay claim. I only knew that this belonged in careful hands, not gossip. Dr. Whitmore arrived the next morning with a camera and a professional's slow, steady curiosity. He did not joke, did not laugh, did not offer the kind of wisecrack a lot of town doctors give when they want to hide being moved. He knelt and measured, took a string and ran it along the curve of the toes, took photographs with a tripod and a Polaroid, one of those that spits out the picture like an animal, and then he said something under his breath. Dear God. He picked up the tarp like a surgeon handling a fragile instrument. He palpated the ankle, then examined the skin with a hand lens and wrote down a series of notes on a legal pad I have still. Hominin-like phalangeal proportions, robust metatarsals, epidermal texture atypical for known North American fauna. His pen was a neat, small scratch. Mr. Hill, he said, looking at me over the pad, are you certain this isn't some sort of hoax, a prop, something set in wax? His voice was careful. It was the kind of thing a man asks when his own disbelief needs a ladder. I'm certain, I said. I told him how I'd been digging, how the bar had slipped, how the soil had given like a mouth letting out breath. I told him what the tape had said. He didn't press further. He took photographs and samples with gloves on, the sort of gloves a mechanic uses when he doesn't want his hands to smell like machine oil for the rest of the day. Tissue samples, small. He used a blade and placed them into vials labeled with my name, the date, September 12th, 1985, and his initials. He told me he'd take them back to the lab. I'll want to run histology, compare bone microstructure, and get some molecular testing, he said. If it is what I suspect, we do this carefully, no sensationalism. That was the phrase that stayed with me, no sensationalism. It felt both like a request and a command. He believed and he feared the consequences of that belief. So did I. though our fears came from different places, his from the integrity of science, mine from the history of this land. 3 days after the find, Whitmore called and asked to meet at the county fairgrounds. There was no big ceremony, just a folding table, a clip-on map, and a handful of people whose faces broke along all the lines of this county. Local reporters, a sergeant from the Fish and Wildlife Service who said his name was Dawson, and 2 more men in plainclothes who wouldn't tell me what agency they were with, at least not at first. The university had brought a stack of printouts. I remember the light that day, a thin, hard light that made everything look honest and mean. Whitmore put his arm on my shoulder and said, "We ran initial tests. I need to be frank."
He read aloud in a slow, measured voice, so the men behind him could copy the words in their own notebooks. The bone architecture was consistent with primate, not bursid or cervid. Epidermal tissue preserved in the sample showed hair follicle patterns not consistent with known mammals in this region. He handed me a single sheet and pointed to a line. 98.5% genetic similarity. He said it twice, like a man tasting a strange wine. 98.5% genetic similarity to modern Homo sapiens. The words fell in circles around everyone. For myself, I felt a kind of slow sliding, like the ground beneath my feet had another slope I hadn't felt before. "So, what are you saying? You're telling me Bigfoot is real?" I heard my own voice and it sounded small and ridiculous even as it asked the question. Whitmore didn't laugh. "I'm saying the sample's markers show a very close relationship to the human clade," he said. He was precise because that was what science asks of a man in a stirring moment. Mitochondrial comparisons and nuclear markers align in a way that strongly suggests this specimen belongs to a separate hominin lineage. Divergence estimates, based on the molecular clock, place their last common ancestor roughly 800,000 years ago. I remember how the men in plain clothes shifted at that. Sergeant Dawson, tightened his jaw as if to keep something from sliding out. One of the plainclothes men folded his arms and said, "We need chain of custody on those vials, Doctor." That phrase, chain of custody, was the first hint that what this was would not be ours to tell. Up to that point, it had been my land, my grandfather's records, my tarped foot in my truck. With those words, the state had laid a fence around the finding. It was a quiet, legal kind of border. Whitmore agreed. He handed over the vials and the documentation he had brought. He also handed a small envelope to me, copies of the Polaroids, a field sketch, a note with his phone number, and the date he'd run the tests. He insisted I keep those for now. "For your records," he said. The scientist's words were precise. The men in suits' words were not. Dawson, who made no bones about saying he was with Fish and Wildlife, told me in a voice that wasn't unkind, "If there is a matter of national significance here, we have to be careful how we proceed. We will be in touch." They were in touch sooner than any of us thought they would be. Before I tell you what happened when the federal man came onto the place with badges and a warrant, there is a piece I need to put on the table so what comes after will make sense. My grandfather bought this property in 1923. He kept ledgers. He kept the kind of journals men do when they want to make the world map itself with their hand. When I was a boy, he would bring those journals out in the winter, and we would read the lists like a kind of family litany. Stock numbers, when someone came into town, days spent repairing fence. He had an entry I never understood until that September. It mentioned a Kalapuya man named Joseph Sixkiller by name. "Joseph may tend the North Tract with permission," one line said in my grandfather's hand, dated spring of 1936. Another entry later noted Joseph carrying loads into the woods. "Wrapped bundles," the entry read, and then a scratch that looked like my grandfather's hand pausing in the dark. I had filed those lines in my head as curiosity, not as a categorical fact. Men come and go in the country. People help each other. There are always wrapped bundles. When Whitmore told me those DNA numbers, those journal lines snapped into a new alignment. The idea that a line in my grandfather's ledger might connect to human-like remains in a burial context stretched across the decades and made a strange map. I had no idea then how close those lines would run to the edge of the official world. After the fairgrounds meeting for a handful of hours, the world contracted to paperwork and phone calls. Whitmore said he would submit samples to the university's molecular lab for a full battery, sequencing, comparisons, carbon dating. He said the soil sample he'd taken around the foot suggested deliberate placement. He used the words contextual preservation. Those are dry words. Dry words are often the first step to something bigger. 3 days after the fairgrounds, I got a call from Whitmore that the lab had more than he expected. The full sequence had come back with numbers he read off slowly into my receiver like a man reading the scripture of an uncertain parish. 98.5% genetic similarity to modern Homo sapiens, he said again, and the divergence appears to be on the order of roughly 800,000 years, according to the models we used. Carbon dating of associated organic material indicates a burial window in the 1930s to early 1940s in at least one nearby context.
There are things that happen to a man when he hears a sentence like that. For myself, it was at once validation and loss. Validation because the strange thing I had found was not a mistake or a trick. Loss because where there is verification, there is usually intervention. I remember thinking of Joseph Sixkiller's name in my grandfather's ledger, and of my grandfather's soft way of keeping other people's business as if it were his own absent-minded raincoat hung in the mudroom out back. I had thought the land's stories were safe in our hands. The sequence of numbers changed that. Within hours of Whitmore's call, men came to the gate. They came not all at once, but in a steady, quiet stream. First a black sedan, then a truck with a government decal I couldn't place, then 2 more plain cars with darkened windows. They pulled up near the old barn and walked the property in pairs. They carried clipboards and wore suits that looked stitched for offices, not timber.
A uniformed deputy from the county sheriff's office arrived and stood a respectful distance, and then a man introduced himself to me as Agent Richard Dawson with Fish and Wildlife Service. He was formal in a way that kept his posture from softening. He had my file in a neat folder. "What do you want?" I said. "We need to secure the area," Dawson said. "There will be an inventory of material, and we'll be executing a warrant. We have a gag order associated with this investigation. For everyone's protection and the integrity of the site, we ask that you refrain from discussing any details with the press or public." He said gag order in that matter-of-fact way. It was not a request. Dawson slid a paper across to me. It was an order stamped and signed, language about preservation of evidence and classification and national significance. The paper told me in black and white that I had 72 hours to vacate certain parts of the property if required, and that access to the North Tract would be restricted. It was a legal wound, small at the surface, but one that would prevent normal breathing. "Mr. Hill," he said, looking me in the eye, "this is not to say we don't value your cooperation, but we are required to secure the scene. There will be questions. You will be provided with counsel." They read me nothing like that in the old movies. There was no dramatic arrest, no sudden storm of men in Kevlar. It was paperwork and a pile of polite words that carried force. The men took inventory of the tarp in my truck, the Polaroids Whitmore had given me, the little vials with his initials on the label. They photographed the area where I had found the foot, took measurements, and placed evidence markers in the soil. The deputy took down our names. I signed a form, as if signing a check. I stood there, on ground where my grandfather had walked, and let a set of strangers arrange my memory. Their presence reframed everything that had been ordinary. The North Tract was the part of the property where Joseph used to go, where my grandfather had written in a ledger about wrapped bundles. I watched men in suits and gloves catalog the earth like it were an exhibit that belonged somewhere other than my hands. They told me not to tell anyone. The word classified came up in their speech, straight, clean, like a door closing. Dawson said, "For now, we cannot disclose details. The proper channels will be coordinated by the agency. You will be given appropriate notice for next steps." My neighbors came by to see what the cars were about. Somebody took a picture from the road with a Polaroid and passed it to the rest like gossip in a small town. By that evening, my mailbox had both the usual bills and a letter with a federal seal offering a token payment for temporary use and cooperation. There was a check. The amount was enough to make you think and not enough to make sense, the sort of number meant to be helpful without being an apology. I did not cash that check. That night, I locked the house and put the Polaroids Whitmore had given me inside the top drawer of my workbench. I took my grandfather's ledger down off the shelf and brushed dust off the page where Joseph's name appeared. The handwriting was as clear as the day it had been written. In my grandfather's careful curve, Joseph Sixkiller, granted use of North Tract, carry wrapped bundles into wood. There was no explanation there, no judgment, just a record of what had happened. I'd spent a life learning to hold silence until it made sense to speak. This was not one of those times where silence was easy. 3 nights later, an envelope appeared in the mailbox under the spot where my wife used to put incoming letters before she passed. It was not a government envelope. It was plain, stamped, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, the same paper Dr. Whitmore had used, the kind that flutters and dries were the secret. It showed the tarp in my truck, the edge of the foot dark under the plastic, with a hand in a glove pointing to the toe. On the back someone had written in tiny letters, "Be careful what's unearthed. J." I do not know if that J was Joseph's hand, or Whitmore's shorthand, or someone else's entirely. It mattered, though. I kept the photograph, because some things need a witness, even when they must be kept quiet. The next morning I drove out to the fence line and walked under the firs where I dug. There were small flags stuck in the ground, and a path of disturbed soil that led to a circle of men.
A geophysical team with a noisy metal detector, boxes of equipment, and trucks with generators. The men worked with floodlights even though it was still early. The lamps painted everything a harsh silver. I stood by the gate with my hands in my pockets while they walked the property as if they were measuring the bones of the place itself. Agent Dawson found me and spoke without the paper between us. "Mr. Hill, for the record, this could be something that requires federal classification. We will need full cooperation. You will be offered indemnification should anything arise." He said this as if it were a pact. It was not a friendship. I felt very small beside a legal world of indemnity and classification. If I had been a man who liked the thought of a newspaper headline, this would have been his dream. I am not that man. I felt the way you do when a doctor tells you something about your own body that cannot be taken back. You are given a diagnosis and asked to sign a form that will decide who else may touch you. Later, back inside the house, I opened my grandfather's ledger and read more entries. There were lines that mentioned stones placed in a pattern, stones that marked places. There was a note, careful, almost a whisper, about the men who came to the woods at night bringing what they called gifts, laid out on bark for those who had been taken. Joseph's name appeared again with dates that ended in 1941.
After that, in the ledger, the page goes quiet. My grandfather's handwriting grows sparse. I lay awake that night thinking about what a human community does when it finds evidence that complicates its story. We can celebrate, we can weaponize, we can reframe, we can hide. The men from the government had used the language of protection, but the armor of protection is sometimes the same as the armor of removal. 3 days after the DNA results, 3 days after Whitmore read the numbers at the fairgrounds, 7 days after I first unwrapped the foot in the truck, the lead agent walked up my front steps with a manila folder and a direct look. He handed me a paper stamped with the same words I'd seen before: 72 hours to vacate if necessary, restricted access, a gag order in place. He told me whom I could speak to, and when, and where. "Mr. Hill," he said, "these are significant remains. We will be cataloging, surveying, and conducting a controlled excavation. We will be removing any material that falls under federal purview." "Who will be doing the excavating?" I asked. He named contractors and agencies I recognized and some I did not. He used words that meant the site would be closed to the public, that any further study would be coordinated with the agencies present. "There will be no public statements," he said, "at least not until we determine the proper classification and handling procedure." "And my grandfather's journals?" I asked. "Those were part of this land's history." "We will note them as part of the contextual record," he said. "They may be requested for review." I remember the way he said "maybe," and how it folded over the ledger like a napkin over a plate of food. I felt then a kind of indignation that was almost silly in its smallness. Indignation because the man in the suit could so neatly arrange my papers like a deck of cards and not drop a one. If there is one honest emotion that sits heavy with me now, it is the feeling that my family had been reclassified in the blink of an official's eye. They set to work in those 72 hours with the pointed efficiency of men doing their jobs. They marked the North Tract with ribbon and light. They placed a sign, restricted access, federal investigation. My neighbor Earl came by and asked if I was all right. I said I was fine, and he nodded and asked no more. This is how towns survive. We do not prod open what our neighbors are prodding. At dusk on the second day, Sergeant Dawson caught my eye and approached me alone for a few minutes. He said, "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Hill. I know this is a difficult time." There was a softness in his voice I had not heard earlier. He handed me a business card and said, "If you need anything, call my office. We'll help where we can." People have different faces. I saw in Dawson a man doing a duty he thought was correct. I saw in Whitmore a scientist stunned by data he did not expect.
I saw in myself a man with one foot in a ledger and the other in a tarp. Not every man in a suit was a villain. Not every scientist was an oracle. People moved along the grid like a clock's hands. On the morning they came with the first small bulldozer, the world felt stripped of its small domestic truths. A generator hummed. They put stakes and ran a grid. They brought in a ground-penetrating radar and waved it back and forth over the slope like a man scanning for treasure. They unrolled tarps and set up screens. I stood and watched until the man in charge, a field archaeologist in a clean cap, flagged an area and called over a technician. The technician knelt and scraped with a trowel and found a bone that was not the one I'd uncovered but was similar. They put a marker by it, and the whole place seemed to tilt, as if the land were answering. I could have fought them. I could have shouted. I could have refused entry or called a lawyer.
Instead, I watched as they worked and signed the paperwork they offered me. Forms about evidence, forms about indemnity, forms about cooperating. I signed them all with hands that did not tremble. Perhaps I signed out of bewilderment. Perhaps I signed out of a wish to protect whatever dignity these remains had by letting professionals handle them. I do not know which motive was higher in me. I only know I signed. Before they loaded anything into crates or trucks, they photographed my grandfather's ledger and made copies. They even lifted a page with a careful gloved hand and wrapped it in acid-free paper like it might be a relic. That moment carried the strangest mixture of honor and theft. They were preserving the record while removing it from the place it had lived. When they finally lifted the tarp from the foot I had wrapped and carried, a man with a camera took a shot, and then another. The foot was placed on a board, cataloged with a tag. I watched men lift it like it was a person and put it into a padded crate. It was not a show, it was business. The crate was sealed and loaded onto a truck along with other materials. The truck left with a slow, purposeful hum. I waved like a man watching a funeral pass. They left me with the ledger and a notice. The area was restricted, the remains were in federal custody, and I was to maintain silence pending further investigation. They promised me nothing more than they would do what the paperwork said. The quiddity of that promise from a man in a suit with a badge was all the law could offer. That night I sat at my kitchen table, with the drawer pulled open and the Polaroids inside. The wooden figure my grandfather had carved years ago sat in the corner, small and solemn. I laid the Polaroids beside it and stared at the one that showed the foot beneath the tarp. The picture was gray around the edges, like an old memory. I kept thinking about Joseph Sixkiller and the ledger entries about wrapped bundles. I thought about the dates that stopped at 1941.
I thought of the way people in the past have tried to make places of care for the dead. Stones, bark, a carved figure left at a grave. The men in suits had moved between my trees and the banks and taken away what my family had tended for years. They had done it with care and with authority. There was an ethic there I could admire, and there was a grief, private and sharp, at having a story lifted from my hands into another's. In the days that followed, the county fairgrounds meeting pages made their rounds. There were press whispers I could not answer to. There were angry calls from a cousin who thought I should have shouted louder. There were people who came to the gate and peered through the fence like it was a theatrical invitation. I said nothing. I had given my word, and I had a small private picture in my drawer to prove everything I couldn't say. Whitmore came by one evening and sat on the back steps with a cup of coffee from a thermos he kept in his truck. He did not try to press me to speak. He only said, "I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked. "For being the one to bring this to light," he said. "For what it will do to your life here." "You're the one who told me the truth of it," I said. "You did right." He shrugged. "I doubted I would ever be in a position to do wrong. But the moment you take a fact out of a field and put it in the world, it takes on other lives. The science will be scrutinized. The land will be restricted. Family histories will be opened. That is the cost." We sat and listened to the wind in the Douglas firs. The trees have a way of making ordinary noise seem like a chorus. There are sounds up here you do not hear in the city. They are patient and old. "I keep thinking about Joseph," I said. Whitmore nodded. "There are threads that run across time. Sometimes science picks up a thread that people were already holding. I think what's important is that we honor those connections. We are obligated to treat the remains, and any cultural elements, with respect." His words were soft and legal and human all at once. He used phrases doctors and scientists use when they want to remind themselves of limits. He did not say what would happen next. None of us could be certain. And yet, something else was certain in a practical way. Once a thing is proven to be more than a rumor, it will be moved. When the men in suits say classification, they mean to make it into a thing that can be controlled. There are reasons for that. There are good reasons. And there are reasons that look like other things if you hold them up to a different light. A week after the discovery, after the men had cataloged and photographed and loaded the crate, after the forms had been signed and the notice posted, Agent Dawson came by the porch again. This time he brought a different man with him, in a suit that didn't seem to belong to a bureaucrat so much as to a man who had everything in his wallet.
He did not speak in the same measured way as before. He explained, plainly, that the finds had been taken into custody and that the matter had been classified. He used the word classified as if it were an adjective that would keep things warm and safe. "Mr. Hill," he said, "the federal designation is intended to preserve scientific integrity and cultural dignity. There will be assessments with tribal liaisons where appropriate, and any culturally sensitive material will be handled with consultation." He named no tribe.
He did not pretend to answer the part of me that worried whether Joseph's people would know what had been done. His face was an honest man's when he looked at me. There was no triumph there, only the weight of paperwork and the carefulness of a career. He extended nothing further verbally, and then he left. The truck with the seal on the door idled for a moment, and then drove off into the gray afternoon. I keep a small Polaroid in my wallet of that day. Not the foot, but the strip of flagged ground, the men at work, the sign that said restricted access, federal investigation. It is a picture that holds one sort of truth, that the official world has ways of turning things into archives and boxes. It is also a picture that holds the other sort of truth. There were things that had been buried on my land for decades, and someone had cared enough to put stones and bark and hands into the ground for them. I cannot tell you what the right answer is for what happens when a private landowner and a federal agency and a scientist and the descendants of a people who once walked those same woods all meet over a set of bones. I can tell you what I chose to do in the first days. I kept my mouth closed except to those who needed to know. I kept a copy of the Polaroids. I did not cash a check that might be called comfort, and I kept the ledger where it has always been. Some nights since then I have taken out the ledger and read Joseph's name and the dates that stop and think what could have been, what kindnesses had been given to the dead, and what past arrangements had been made between men and land that we never quite learn until something forces them into the light. I have thought of the word dignity a lot. The agents used it. The scientists used it. I have tried to cradle it like something fragile. I have also wondered, because a man cannot help himself from a question, whether there are still footsteps these trees here that are not mine. The evidence we had showed a close relation to humans. The DNA, Whitmore said, placed the split at roughly 800,000 years. That means, if you follow the science, that we were looking at a branch of the family tree separate and ancient. How that branch had met the 20th century in those hills is a history stitched with private hands and quiet stones.
But for all the science and the paperwork and the men with cameras, there was still a person who once knelt in the woods and wrapped a body in bark and laid down a carved figure. There was a human who had taken care of something he considered worth keeping safe. That is where my decision began to harden. The thing we had found was not merely a specimen. It had been tended by people who had names and stories and lines in the ledger. It was a matter of respect, not spectacle. When the agents left that first week, they left a list of restrictions and forms and an envelope with a notice that the remains had been transferred to federal custody. They told me a controlled excavation would be conducted and that any material removed from the site would be cataloged and stored under federal custody. They said the excavation would be controlled, that everything would be photographed, measured, boxed, and logged. They said it in the same cool voice with which a butcher tells you what time the shop closes. I watched them plan the work with the same steady attention they had given the tarp in my truck. When the digging began in earnest, it felt less like an unveiling than like a careful reckoning. They brought people who knew how to read the ground in ways I didn't, archaeologists with clean nails and careful gloves, a team from a lab with portable refrigeration units, a tech with a ground-penetrating radar that breathed over the slope in slow arcs. They ran a grid and staked it out with such exactness that even the trees seemed to stand slightly straighter, as if braced for scrutiny. At night they worked under floodlights that turned the firs into black silhouettes against a bright, clinical sky. They found more than the foot. I don't mean to be the sort of man who tallies things for the thrill of a list, but the record needs numbers because numbers are the language the official world understands. Over the course of several days, they exposed 9 distinct interments arranged in a pattern, a loose circle of graves set in a regular grid. Each burial lay in its own cut, grave pits carefully lined or tamped, the fill showing signs of deliberate placement and occasional packing. In one corner of the grid, a stone marker remained, half sunk into moss, the same kind my grandfather had drawn in his ledger. In another place, they lifted a length of bark that had been folded and found beneath it a bundle of woven fibers, the weave fine and strong, like the cords a basket maker might use. What struck the field team, and later the reports I was allowed to keep a copy of, was the consistency. The stones repeated a pattern. The bundles were wrapped in bark, some with strips of woven material. In one grave, a small carved wooden figure lay near the skull, smooth with age and handled enough to have a shine from hands. Another grave held pieces of bark with drawings on them, simple lines and spirals, charred in places but still legible as marks of intention.
They called these items grave goods in their notes. They photographed each item with scales and color cards and placed the photos into acid-free folders. Some of the remains showed signs that made me sick to look at once I knew what I was seeing. A couple of bones bore perimortem trauma, breaks and marks consistent with blunt force and cutting. The field report used clinical language, evidence consistent with traumatic injury. And then in a footnote it allowed what my grandfather's ledger had only hinted at. There had been violent encounters in these hills in the late 1930s.
Some of the vessels and bark wrappings suggested care and tenderness. Elsewhere, the bones told a story of harm. You could see in the juxtaposition a history of complexity. Care, companionship, and conflict braided together over decades. They took everything. The field crates filled and were labeled. Context North Tract, Unit A, Burial 2, and so on. Each crate was catalogued, sealed, and loaded onto trucks with covered beds. The men worked quickly, but not hurriedly. There was a solemnity to it that sometimes felt respectful, and sometimes felt like something else entirely. They brought tribal liaisons. They brought specialists in osteology and cultural preservation. They brought ground samples that showed chemical signatures consistent with deliberate preservation of the burials, soil conditions and context that suggested people had taken steps to keep the remains from decaying as quickly as would naturally happen. That phrase, deliberate preservation, showed up in more than one report. David, my boy, came down to help the day they opened the second grave. He stood quiet by the tape and the stakes, hands jammed into his pockets like he wanted to hold himself together. He'd driven in from town with a thermos and some power bars and the kind of concerned look only your child can offer when he sees the shape of his father's life altered. He reminded me of someone I was proud to be and someone I was afraid of losing. We talked a little. We watched. I read the interim field reports the men furnished me in that week with an attention that was almost religious. I had access to redacted pages, copies of photographs with sensitive bits blacked out, and notes that told me what the lab had found in cautious prose. They did the carbon dating on the organic wrappings and the samples associated with several of the burials. The dates clustered in the window my grandfather's ledger hinted at, the mid-1930s through the early 1940s. In plain language, people had been burying here during that period. The pattern of dates lined up with entries in the ledger that recorded Joseph's presence and work on the North Tract through 1941. The lines that had once seemed small history suddenly read like a map pointing to these graves. It would have been easy to watch the men and let my anger or my pride call the tune. I didn't want to be the man who made the discovery into a spectacle.
Still, there were moments when my chest tightened with a kind of complaint. There were officers who spoke in measured tones about classification and chain of custody and national security, and there were others who, in private, spoke differently. Agent Carson was one of those others. He was not the man in the neat front office suit with a file of legal forms. He had a way of looking at you like he wanted to find the human beneath the farmer clothes. He came by one afternoon when the field work had paused for a storm and sat on the back step with me while thunder moved over the ridge. He didn't try to justify the seizure or to excuse the forms. He said plainly, "I know you think we're taking something that should perhaps stay here. I'm sorry." He did not say it like an apology that whores himself out of his duty. He spoke it like a man who felt duty's edges as well. A week after the main excavation, when the bulk of the remains and artifacts had been crated and moved, Carson came to my porch with a small envelope folded with care. He said he'd arranged for a personal copy of a few images and a wooden object to be given to me. He warned me I could not show it to anyone, that there were legal seals and NDAs, and that he was running a risk by being tender in his way. He slid the envelope across the step and looked me in the eye. "If you need a witness," he said, "I'm offering what I can, but understand what you're getting into." I took the envelope home and left it on the kitchen table until the house went quiet. Inside, folded in wax paper, were 2 glossy prints and a small carved figure no larger than my palm. The prints were photographs of one of the grave goods, close shots of the carved figure in situ, a drawing on bark beside it. The wooden figure Carson had given me felt warm and worn from being touched. Its face was simple, incised with 2 eyes and a line for a mouth. It was not a thing of spectacle. It was an object someone had placed with a body as you would place a hand on a chest, for comfort, for remembering. I slid the little carving into the secret drawer in my workbench where I kept the ledger and the Polaroids and the other small things that made a story both possible and private. When the men offered compensation, it came with forms you could read as either help or hush. There was a check, an envelope with a number that could have paid for the taxes that year, and then some. The paperwork that came with it was dense and framed as aid for temporary use and cooperation. There were paragraphs in that paper that said the agency would hold the property in trust during the investigation, and that access would be limited. There were mentions of indemnity and promises of organized consultation. It was the sort of thing that was polite and swallowing at once. I did not cash the check. I walked it around my hands like a thing too hot to hold. David asked me why, and I said because it felt like someone was trying to buy a story that wasn't theirs to sell.
He didn't press. He knew me. My refusal wasn't grandstanding. It was small, stubborn, and afraid to be generous. The offer was an attempt to close a wound you could live with if you let it. I wasn't ready to let a wound that felt right for my family be closed by a stranger's ink. They asked me to sign NDAs. The papers said I understood the sensitivity of the matter, that I would refrain from speaking with the press, that I would not show or share photographs or material related to the finds. The words were formal where my feelings were not. I signed what they required because I wanted to protect something beyond myself. There is a dignity in the way Joseph wrapped the dead in bark and placed stones. There is a dignity, too, in the way one family keeps its secrets, when those secrets are not simply their own to exploit. Signing the papers did not feel like surrender. It felt like choosing a way to honor those who had been put in the ground with care. After the crates left, after the men with generators drove away and the floodlights were taken down, there was a kind of hollow quiet on the North Tract. The ribbon was still on the map stakes, but the noise of science and government faded. I walked the places where the dead had been, where the stones had been set. The ground looked the same and not the same. There were scars that would, in time, weather and soften, but the memory of neat grid lines and trowel marks remained in my head like a photograph. I kept one thing of practical use as a chain. I was given redacted copies of the field notes and an instruction about custody of certain materials. Whitmore left me a copy of his correspondence and a note. "Do not expose this to the press yet. It will not help." His handwriting slanted a little angrily at the end. He had been pulled between the duty of a scientist and the duty of a man who cares for other people's lives. In the months that followed, the tenor of the town shifted in ways that were subtle at first, and then more obvious. People who had known my grandfather's ledger now asked about it. Old friends who had kept their distance came by with half questions. I learned that someone had made a Freedom of Information request in the next county over, and that the agency had responded with some pages in black squares. There were editors who called David, hoping he would sell a story that went beyond the forms I had signed. I told him to hang up. I told him that some things were not ours to unfold for profit. There was talk, because there will always be talk, that a discovery like ours was going to shift how people thought about the woods, about the past, about what else might have been hidden here for decades. I listened to those conversations at the feed store and at the church potluck. I said nothing more than "I can't speak to it" when asked. Silence is a kind of action too. The choice to withhold a story can be as decisive as the choice to tell it. I spent evenings reading my grandfather's ledger by lamplight. There were lines I had missed before, tiny notations about stones and about a man named Joseph having permission to keep certain places. There were receipts for tobacco and coffee given out for help, little signs of barter and trust. The ledger recorded instances of people tending to things on the land with such casual compassion that it made me ache. Someone paying attention to the dead without a need for public confirmation. In a way, Joseph's practice of wrapping bodies and leaving gifts out of sight had more integrity to me than all the headlines I could imagine. Not everything the government did was secretive in a way intended to harm. They engaged with tribal liaisons, they contacted area cultural preservation offices, and they documented items with a seriousness that felt sometimes like reverence. There were meetings I was not invited to, and presentations given behind closed doors. The word classification kept showing up in emails and the thin, clipped language of legal forms. It is a word that can be used to shield or to steward. I could never be certain which use applied at every turn. One afternoon, when the main dust had settled, Agent Dawson returned with a folder that was, externally, nothing more than a stack of bureaucratic papers. Inside it, though, were copies of correspondence documenting the chain of custody and a notice detailing restrictions placed on the North Tract. Permits required for entry, access limited to authorized personnel. The letter mentioned the need for consultation in case of culturally sensitive material, and the intention to work with any descendants or recognized tribal authorities. It was cautious language. I accepted it, but my trust in cautious language was tempered by the quiet that had been imposed on me. There was another moment, smaller and private, that I have thought about often. It happened when a young woman from the Cultural Review team, she introduced herself politely and said she was there reading for the agency, waited behind the trucks as they loaded, and then asked in a low voice whether anyone had thought to notify descendants of Joseph's people. Her question had a kind of moral directness that struck me. After that, the agency did make efforts to contact appropriate liaisons and to involve people who could speak to the cultural aspects of what had been found. Whether those efforts were sufficient, I cannot say.
I only know that the men who had carved a small figure and drawn on bark had been tended by hands that deserved to be consulted. A conversation I remember poorly in the details, but not in the weight of it, was with Whitmore in a motel room on the edge of town a month later. He'd left the university temporarily, his hair ruffled, his face worn in a way that said he had not slept well.
We sat at a thin table with coffee cups under a low motel light. He had in his hand the initial lab printouts and charts, and he read aloud, as if to give me the words one last time. We found a 98.5% genetic similarity to modern Homo sapiens in the nuclear markers and mitochondrial sequences we compared. Divergence models placed the last common ancestor at roughly 800,000 years. Those numbers sat between us like cold stones. I said, "What does that mean to me?" "It means you found evidence of a hominin lineage, close to humans, but distinct," he said. "It means that genetically, these individuals were not the same as Homo sapiens, but they were part of our greater family tree. It means the conversation about what we do with the remains is not just scientific, it's cultural and ethical." He folded his hands and looked at me. "It's a heavy thing." It was. The science gave the discovery a name and a firmness, but naming it did not make the moral questions go away. If anything, it sharpened them. The lives of those buried on my land were not artifacts to be marveled at without thought. They had been wrapped and cared for, and they were connected, through Joseph, to a set of people whose lines continued in ways I could not trace with neat bureaucratic boxes. As the investigations concluded their main fieldwork, the agency drafted a set of long-term restrictions on the North Tract. There were forms to sign and filings to make. They asked whether I'd consider conveying the North Tract to a conservation body that would hold it under conditions protecting the burial sites and preventing future disturbance. The idea was framed as stewardship. By placing the land in caretaker hands, the graves could rest without fear of development or curiosity-driven digging. The thought of giving up land my grandfather had walked made my chest tighten, but I had been thinking of the land differently since the moment my shovel slipped and revealed the foot. It no longer felt solely like a piece of property. It was a place of memory, a place of care, and now, evidently, a place of historical and cultural consequence that needed protection beyond my lifetime. After nights of talking with David and sitting at the table with the ledger and the small carved figure in the drawer, I decided to convey the North Tract with specific covenants. I sought out a local conservation group, one that would accept terms preventing future disturbance and ensuring that should any research be undertaken, tribal consultation and cultural sensitivity were prioritized. The process took months. It was not done lightly. The conveyance was legal, written and witnessed, with language that bound the land to preservation and restricted intrusive activity without proper protocols. The final paperwork sat on my shelf for a day before I signed it. When I did, I felt something loosen and something else close. I do not tell this to boast, but to be clear about the choice I made.
The federal machinery could have taken the land and kept the story for the state. I chose a different custody, one that I hoped would honor the dead and the ledger's memory by keeping the ground under watch and preventing private hands or profit from digging deeper. There were consequences to that choice. Some folks whispered that I had sold out. Others thought I had been naive. There were lawyers who told me the deed would be contested by someone in time, and there were those who thought the federal restrictions were themselves enough. I listened, and I stayed with the decision. The land, in my mind, belonged to the memory of those who had been laid there, and in my small way I wanted to offer them a guard against further disturbance. Years have a way of dulling the edges of things, but some images hold their shape. I still keep the carved figure in that secret drawer. I take it out sometimes and feel the worn edges with a thumb. The Polaroids Whitmore gave me, some of them photocopies, are tucked away where I can find them if I need the proof of the day. Agent Carson's envelope with its small images sits beside the ledger. I have not shown them. I do not publish them. The legality of the NDAs and the classified nature of much of the material make that a practical choice, but it is also, for me, a moral one. There were moments when I was tempted to tell it all. A cousin called and said the world needed to know. A reporter left a message with a polite demand for comment. I did not answer. I told David that history sometimes needs caretakers more than it needs publicity. He rolled his eyes at me in the way a son does, and then he would call to check whether I had been left alone by the night. The ledger and the figure were my small, stubborn defiance against the world treating the dead as currency. The reports that filtered back from the labs in the agency's archive confirmed what Whitmore had said. The DNA analysis placed the remains in a hominin lineage closely related to modern humans. The phrasing in the redacted public brief used the exact number I had been given in that county fairground meeting, 98.5% genetic similarity to modern Homo sapiens, and divergence on the order of roughly 800,000 years.
The reports were careful to tabulate what they could and to mark with blacked-out boxes what they said could not be shared publicly. It was as if the truth had been given a face and then draped with a curtain. There have been hints and rumors since, the sort of things small towns carry like a loose stone in a pocket. An old man recalls seeing a creature years ago on a ridge. A hunter tells of tracks larger than a man's boot. The stories are not evidence, they are echoes. The science we had showed a close relation to humans, and the burials in the wood showed a relationship between two kinds of lives that once met this place. Whether any of their kind survive now is something I cannot know, and I will not claim to know.
The transcript of what we found suggests the possibility, but offers no proof of living populations. I say only this cautiously. If any live, they would be hidden as Joseph and my grandfather hoped to keep them, by care and by silence. As the years passed, my perspective on secrecy shifted in a way that surprised me. At first, I saw the gag order and the classification as theft, an outside hand closing the shutters on our family story. Over time, I came to see that secrecy can also be a kind of shelter. The men who wrapped the dead in bark did so in a world where exposure could mean desecration. The federal restrictions were clumsy and bureaucratic and sometimes cold, but they also created a buffer, a way to ensure that the graves would not be plundered in the near term. I do not pretend any system is perfect, nor do I imagine that my decision to support preservation was above criticism. It was simply the choice I felt honored the people who had been buried there. I am not a man given to grand pronouncements. I have always believed that land has memory because men and women remember where they have loved and fear where they have failed. The North Tract had been a place of small, private acts, stones laid, bark used as a shroud, a carved figure tucked by a hand, and suddenly the whole apparatus of state and science pressed in. I had to choose whether to fight for the right to have the story told in my voice or to steward the land in a manner that protected what the dead had been given. I chose protection. In the years since, the North Tract has been managed by a trust under covenants that restrict disturbance and require consultation for any research. The field notes accessible to the public are limited. There are summary statements that preserve the gist without giving away sensitive detail. I think that is as it should be. There are people who would see such restraint as cowardly or secretive for its own sake. I see it as a continuation of how my grandfather kept other people's business, a kind of quiet guardianship. There are nights when I sit on the back steps and listen to the wind move through the Douglas firs, and I imagine the hands that once placed bark and stones. The wood creaks and the firs clap in the dark, and sometimes I swear I hear the shape of another footfall between the trees. Always a thought, never proof. My life has been a series of ordinary chores and occasional jolts like that day with the shovel. In the quiet seasons, I take the carved figure from the drawer and hold it like a promise. I think of Joseph, of the ledger that bears his name in my grandfather's hand, and of the people who loved and buried the ones they tended. I keep those memories like the edge of a knife. I use only when necessary. What we discovered on that day in September of 1985 changed how I saw this land and the people who had walked it. The DNA numbers, the 98.5% genetic similarity, and the divergence roughly 800,000 years, gave the find scientific weight. The graves and artifacts gave it human story and dignity. The federal response gave it containment and, whether rightly or wrongly, a measure of protection. My choice to preserve rather than to profit, to sign NDAs rather than to shout from the rooftops, has been both a blessing and a burden. If there is a final note to this, it is a small one. I still keep the envelope of photographs Carson gave me, and the Polaroids Whitmore trusted me with. I still keep the ledger on the shelf, and the little carved figure hidden where hands will find it when I am gone. I listen for footsteps I cannot verify, and I let the memory of those buried remain delicate. The world has ways of turning strange things into museum pieces or headlines. I wanted something steadier for the dead who had been laid to rest here. If you asked me whether the DNA proves it is real, I would say this: the science we had shows a close genetic relationship to humans, 98.5%, and a lineage that split from our own long ago. That is a factual thing, and it is why the men in suits came so quickly. But facts alone do not tell you how to act. They tell you only what you have found. What you do with that knowledge is where ethics begin.
So I keep my mouth mostly shut, not out of fear of punishment, but out of fear of harm. I honor the work Joseph did in the way I can, by preserving the ground he tended, by keeping the carved figure safe, and by refusing to turn private grief into public curiosity. If the world one day needs to know more, I hope it will be in a way that respects both the science and the dignity of those who are buried. Until then, on quiet nights, I sit and listen to the furs and wonder, as any man does when he has held something like a secret, whether someone else is keeping watch in the woods, as Joseph once did. If you'd like to explore more documented mysteries and the untold stories behind them, like and subscribe.